Hi, I'm Susan Cauley, and welcome to You're Not Alone Surviving a Child's Disability. Self-advocacy for a person with a disability is a step towards independence, having an awareness of their individual needs and wants. Talking about self-advocacy today is Stephen Higgins, Executive Director, Independent Associates. Hi, Steve. How are you?
Doing fantastic. And yourself?
Oh, good. I'm glad you could make it today.
Thanks. We're glad to be here.
Well, let's start out with, can you tell me what the difference is between advocacy and self-advocacy?
So when you look at advocacy, there's a couple ways that you can look at it. You have self-advocacy. A lot of people have individual advocacy. And then a lot of times I like to look at it as systems advocacy or community advocacy.
Mm-hmm.
The big difference between them all is what it comes down to is community and systems advocacy is when a bunch of us as advocates get together to work for something that we see is needing change in our community, whether that's in our school systems, whether that's at the State House in Boston, or even down in Washington, D.C.,
mm-hmm.
and how that affects our outcomes as a whole, as a group. Self-advocacy as a whole is becoming an advocate and being willing and learning how to speak for yourself.
Okay.
Speaking of what are the skills that I need to learn, what are the pieces that I need to learn in order to be able to navigate this fractured and broken system that sometimes we call education, healthcare, government, housing, all those things that we put together that, to live a healthy life as a person with a disability.
Oh, well, as far as advocacy goes, that's a tricky word.
Absolutely. Say it 10 times, you're in trouble.
Yeah. Now, a straight advocacy role would be maybe a parent or a caregiver as far as taking care of somebody who has a disability.
So the answer would be yes and yes, because the advocacy or the advocate role, many of us play the role as advocate. We play the role as advocates as parents. We play the role as advocates as teachers many times. We play the role as advocates in the role that I play many times on the systems side,
Mm-hmm.
where an individual parent or a teacher or a group might not have that opportunity to work in a larger forum, so to say, like
Right.
the Federation of Children or other organizations.
Mm-hmm.
And so there's many times that there's the role that as an advocate I would go in speaking with a group of advocates or others together. Several of us did that yesterday.
Okay.
At the State House in Boston,
Mm-hmm.
for example. We went in to talk about a program called the Alternative Housing Voucher Program.
Right.
Which is a program that helps persons with disabilities ages 18 to 60 in that place that usually falls through the cracks to gain access to affordable and available and accessible housing.
Oh, yes.
And so
definitely.
we were at the State House with a group of us advocates
Mm-hmm.
from different organizations. So doing that, members of the legislature were able to see that there was a coalition,
Mm-hmm.
which was a bunch of advocates coming together advocating towards a single cause.
Now, why would a person with a disability want to be a self-advocate?
Well, I think self-advocacy goes to the heart and the philosophy of the independent living movement. In Massachusetts, we were one of the first states to have independent living centers. The Boston Center for Independent Living, which actually
Right.
serves this town, Woburn, was one of the first independent living centers in our country.
Oh, I didn't know
And in Massachusetts, currently, we have a network of 11 independent living centers throughout the state. If anybody views this from a different town and is wondering where do I go, what independent living center do I turn to, there's a great resource on the internet. It's the Massachusetts Statewide Independent Living Council.
that. Okay.
I'm actually appointed to the council by the governor. And on the council's website, you can click on a little button that says Massachusetts Independent Living Centers,
Mm-hmm.
and it lists all 11 independent living centers.
Okay.
And every community in our state is listed by the independent living center that serves them.
Mm-hmm.
Now, independent living history and philosophy, when we look at it, there's a saying that you'll hear a lot in the independent living movement, and that's nothing about me without me. So when we look at ourselves as advocates, many times, whether it's the medical system, whether it's the school system or others, we always have people that want to talk about us. And what nothing about me without me is it reminds us that I need to be at the table when there's decisions that are being made about me. As a young person with a disability, I want to be at the table when there's decisions being made about what my IEP is going to include.
Right.
I want to have a choice to not be told that at 14 years old I'm going to have to live on the Social Security system,
right.
But that I might be able to get a job and go to college and do all the things that my non-disabled brothers and sisters that are in that same building we call a school as me are given access to every single day.
Right.
And so self-advocacy is about developing that inner voice within yourself and being able to understand that nothing about me without me is the driving force behind self-advocacy.
I see. Now, when should parents begin to teach skills that would foster self-advocacy?
It's different with every child, but I say from day one.
Day one? Now, how would you do that?
Well, a lot of that is communication. One of the biggest things that we deal with is teaching folks how to communicate with each other,
right.
How to interact with each other. I kind of grew up in this independent living movement, and I was one of those folks that went to school in the 60s and 70s. And in the 60s and 70s, I went into school and they told me I was special. Now, of course, I like that idea because I always considered myself special, but I didn't look at the
idea that it was a disability.
It was a disability, and so growing up in the 70s and 60s, and graduating from high school in 1981 with a learning disability, that was something that was new to a lot of folks.
Oh, definitely.
And I went to a school that I'll give you the clean version of it, but. In the 8th grade, I was told by my guidance counselor that I should go to Bristol Aggie because shoveling manure would be good for me.
Really? Was he really serious?
Now, the interesting thing, he was serious about it. The interesting thing was what the guidance counselor didn't know was I wanted to go to Bristol Aggie.
Oh.
and yes, I had to do that because everybody in their freshman year had to do that. But I went to Bristol Aggie because I loved landscaping. I loved design.
I see.
And so I was able to find something for myself as a young person that I could do and that I could excel at. And so, a lot of times it's starting when you're little. I have a set of twin daughters. And we used when my daughters were young, I used to take them along with me. And a lot of times it would be out doing something like a systems advocacy piece, like in our community. Are there curb cuts that are accessible? Are the ramps accessible? Do they work?
Right.
I have a member of my family, my wife, who grew up here in the Woburn-Winchester area, Andrea, who uses a mobility device.
Yep.
So for us, having that experience of, it's scary that here we are in 2017 and sometimes we still have to go in the back door because there's not an accessible entrance.
Definitely.
And so, from the time my daughters, could toddle along with me, they would be out there with me and, we'd measure a curb cut and see if it was accessible. They'd hold the ruler or they'd take the picture.
But mainly, most people wouldn't go to those extremes. I mean, what is it that a parent could do, like if they didn't have like a position like you have? I mean, what would be something they could start out with? How could they teach them how to be independent?
Well, the most important thing that I'll say is the parent themselves has to be strong and independent. And I say that because advocacy is a skill that's learned by doing. And to teach advocacy, you have to have experienced advocacy. The challenge that many of our parents face, especially many of our parents that are growing up, we're all growing up still. I claim to still be growing up. I got a long way to go. I'm only 55. But a lot of our parents themselves, when you become a parent of a child with a disability, have never experienced disability themselves. And so at the same time that they would want you to be encouraging their child to become an advocate,
right,
they're becoming advocates on their own.
Themselves, yeah.
And so that's why it's a shared experience.
I see.
It's an experience that the word advocacy just, I mean, it scares the heck out of a lot of people.
Oh, yeah.
And especially if you look at, advocacy on a grassroots level.
Mm-hmm.
If you put grassroots and advocacy in the same sentence, that's not popular with a lot of people.
Right.
And some people look back, well, you're one of those radicals or something like that. And so I think the biggest thing that you can teach about advocacy is don't fear it. Don't be afraid. As a parent, don't fear the advocacy, but also understand that it's frustrating.
But wouldn't a parent, wouldn't you also teach a child that not to be afraid of themselves, their inner self?
Absolutely. There's this thing called disability pride.
Mm-hmm.
I talk about it with a lot of our younger folks. I was working with a couple staff at our organization today. And one of the things that we talked about is we're not afraid to say who we are as people with disabilities.
Right.
I have an advantage. I have a hidden disability.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of people don't necessarily look at me as a person with a disability unless I self-identify.
Right. And a lot of people with learning disabilities are that way.
Exactly. And my wife Andrea will say she brings her prop. She has her mobility device with
mm-hmm.
her. And self-identifying in not being ashamed of who you are.
Right.
Unfortunately, our kids start to hear things from the time that they can toddle around or use a mobility device or
mm-hmm.
however it is that we use to get around.
Right.
We look different. We act different.
Mm-hmm.
We sound different. And, so many times what it is that other people, and even to this day, we'll be out there, and my wife and I, and you'll see a mom or dad when their little kid comes up and touches the wheelchair, and they're like, and they
right.
freak, and we're like, why?
I know.
Why? You're not going to catch anything.
Uh-huh.
And
don't be afraid.
Right.
It's
like
of something different,
question,
something new.
The thing that scares most of us is fear. That fear of change, that fear of being different, that fear of embracing who we are.
Mm-hmm.
And the biggest thing that we can teach a young person today, regardless of whether they have a disability, is to be proud of who you are.
Right.
Not to be ashamed of who you are, to live your life out loud, to understand that in today's society, there's an app for that. Whether it's on one of those things that one of those devices or whatever, there's an app for that.
Right.
And so even as a young person with a disability, you can participate in society just like everyone else.
Right. If, iPad or whatever.
Sure,
your computer,
absolutely. And
cell phone.
And there's access to those things.
Mm-hmm.
Many times the school systems will say, "Oh, we're only going to give you an iPad, but you can only use it in our school." Well, what do I do when I get home?
Right.
And so a lot of times we have folks come to us at the Independent Living Center and at all of the independent living centers in the state. Well, how do I get access to those same things in my home?
Oh, geez.
And so, guiding people through that fractured, broken system to get there. But, most people don't know that there's an assistive technology loan program in Massachusetts.
Right, there is. From who was it from?
Through Easter Seals.
Easter Seals, that's right.
Easter Seals of Mass. And one of the cool things about that program is there's a small program built inside of that just as an example that works with devices that cost under $500.
Right.
That a family might not be able to afford. But, an iPad fits into that.
Right.
Well, maybe that iPad could be loaned to a young person with a disability, and now they can go out and do the same thing that everybody else does.
Right. That's great. I never thought of it that way, but yeah. Now, what do you think is the most important skill that a person might need as far as advocating for themselves?
The most important skill is your attitude.
Mm-hmm.
And, we talk a lot of times, but you have to be able to maintain an attitude and a willingness of, this is my goal.
Mm-hmm.
This is what I need.
And this is what you want,
right.
basically.
And you know, many times the school system, when we go in to sit down and do an IEP,
mm-hmm.
the school system is dealing with all that thing called budgets and all the poop that goes with it, and
right.
you know, designing these things. And so sometimes the school system's going to say we can't do that.
Yeah, they always have an excuse.
Sure. But we need to be willing as an advocate to say no.
Mm-hmm.
That's not acceptable.
Right.
And you know, those are important words to learn as an advocate. No, I'm sorry, but that's not acceptable.
Mm-hmm.
And because if you say that's not acceptable enough times, they're going to ask you, what's acceptable? What is acceptable? What is it that you need to, you know, to excel?
Right.
And you know, so many times it's that attitude that I'm going to go in there and I'm only going to settle for what's acceptable.
Now, what type of issues would somebody go in and advocate for? Like, for instance, education, or I mean, what are some of the subjects that they would?
So in education, just, you know, let's just stay right there for a little while. So in education, as a young student, it might be to be able to attend the classes I want to go to.
Right.
Now, but let's start out in the parking lot.
Yeah. Okay.
So out in the parking lot, is there an accessible parking space?
Oh yeah. Okay.
Is the path of travel to the building accessible? Can I get in the front door?
Right.
What if I want to go in the front door as a young student with a disability independently? Does the school have a power door opener? Does it work?
Yeah.
You know, does it work? Now that's the next best question of the day, because a lot of times, you know, people will go out there and they'll provide all kinds of accessibility devices, but then they don't check the battery on the door opener.
Right.
So
they don't check if it works.
Absolutely.
Actually,
And it starts with, as a young person with a disability, can I get in the front door?
Yeah.
So in other words, is my school welcoming me the same way it's welcoming every other student in the front door?
Right.
Can I get in the front door today? So now that I can get in the front door, can I get into the classrooms?
Right.
If there's an inaccessible classroom, can a good advocate, if the classroom's inaccessible and they say, oh no, you can't attend that class because it's inaccessible, a reasonable accommodation would be to ask, can that class be provided in a different room within the school so that everyone that wants to attend that class can have access to that class?
So you give them options, in other words.
Absolutely. When we look at free and appropriate public education, FAPE, things that we hear on the federal level, and of course we know those are by some folks being challenged in Washington right now, and that in itself is a very scary thing.
Yeah, definitely.
But when we look at going into the public school as a young person, you know, can I go through the lunch line like everyone else?
Right. Because those are important things for a teenager or even a young child who is, you know.
Sure. Where do students in the school gather?
Right.
You know, when they want to just hang out, where do they gather? Is that accessible?
That's a lot to think about.
You know, one of our local schools, there's this big thing out there now called, in some of our schools, a Google staircase, where they'll build this big staircase where students gather and stuff like that. But unfortunately, they'll put a space at the bottom and a space at the top.
So you
But
can't,
if you're a person with a disability
or a wheelchair
and you want to talk with your friends, and your friends are on the third level, how do you get there? How do you get there? So as a young person, it's like, can I participate in the school just like everyone else?
Right.
And so there's so many things that we, you know, when you look at it, education goes beyond the book and the classroom. Education goes to being able to participate fully, like our non-disabled brothers and sisters.
Now, what are some equal rights laws that a self-advocate should really know about?
Well, start with the Americans with Disabilities Act. You know, the Americans with Disabilities Act, when you look at it as a person with a disability, it is probably the most significant piece of civil rights legislation that was ever introduced. You know, and a lot of people say that in today's day and age that you can't accomplish things like that. Well, the Americans with Disabilities Act was one of the few acts in the recent years that had support of everyone. It was introduced by a Republican president and signed.
Yep.
There were people that were from different, Democrat sides, Ted Kennedy, all kinds of folks like that in Massachusetts worked towards it. But what the Americans with Disabilities Act did is it opened our doors. It opened our doors that solidified some of the things like IDEA, which involves education, and the Air Carriers Act, so that we could fly on airplanes, access to public transportation, all of the different things. But the ADA opened the door to a lot of those things, and the ADA, sometimes folks look at it as a barrier. I serve as a member of the National Council on Independent Living in Washington, D.C., and I chair the Americans with Disabilities Act Civil Rights Committee. And so, the challenges that we're looking at today is not rolling back the Americans with Disabilities Act. There's people out there in some states that would like to see the Americans with Disabilities Act rolled back because it's too hard to comply with that. As a business, 26 years after the ADA, why do I have to, why should people need to come in my front door? We've never seen a person in a wheelchair here, but we have 7 steps.
Oh, cheers. Right.
And so that, from a civil rights standpoint, from an advocate standpoint, the Americans with Disabilities Act, when it was signed on July 26th, 26 years ago, that was our Independence Day.
Right. Now, how important is it for a teenager with a disability to be really involved with their education?
It's incredible. Incredibly important, incredible, all of those. Is a teenager right now understanding that there are options? There's 2 programs in Massachusetts that are really phenomenal. And Boston Center for Independent Living, which serves the Woburn area, would be the resource for these programs. One is called the Transition to Adulthood Program, and one is called the Transitional Internship Program. So there's the acronyms, the TAP and the TIP, and stuff like that. Now, the difference between the 2 programs, and there's also another program in our state called Pre-Education and Training Services, which several of the independent living centers and others are also becoming involved with. Now, what these programs are is they're programs that, as a young person with a disability, where you have the opportunity to learn those life skills and those basic skills that some of your other peers are getting elsewhere.
I see.
The TAP program, for example, there's group trainings where kids come together and work together to solve issues. Sometimes it's just to play a video game. Because it's learning socialization skills, things like that. But for an example, one of the components of that program, the TAP program in Massachusetts, is a self-advocacy piece.
Oh, okay.
And so as a young person, you might learn with a group about what this is. So we each year in Massachusetts do an Independent Living Education Day at our State House. So this year that's going to take place on March 22nd. And this is an opportunity where advocates from around the state come together at the grand staircase of the State House, talk about our priorities, and then have a sandwich and go out and visit legislators.
Oh, that's
so one of the components that we're doing at our center, now I can't say BCIL and every center is doing this, is we're bringing a bunch of our young folks in our TAP program to Boston. And how we're doing that is we're looking at it, all of the skills you can learn that day.
Right.
Well, some of the kids have never gotten on the train.
Wow.
So how do you get on the train? Well, once you get into Boston, what do you do when you get off the train?
Right.
How do you get to the State House?
Right.
God forbid going through the State House, you're going to have to go through the detector and all of that stuff.
Yeah.
But throughout the day, the skills that these young folks are learning, it's a fun experience, but they're being empowered at the same time. Some of our young folks have never met, some of our teens have never met a legislator.
Wow.
So if you're standing in an office with a legislator, and the legislator asks this group of kids, hey, so what town are you from? Hey, that's my town. You're one of my constituents.
Yeah.
And all of a sudden, a young person that was afraid starts to establish a relationship and an understanding that I can do this. You know, the legislators, they're not a rock star. You know, they put on their clothes the same way I do.
Now, what about now when you're turning 22? It's kind of like a whole different story.
Yeah, that's that cliff thing.
And they have ISPs instead of IEPs. And I was just wondering how much an adult has to advocate for themselves as an adult versus being a teenager.
Well, I kind of look at myself as a little kid in a big kid suit. and I think a lot of times that as a teenager we have to look at ourselves the same way. That whole thing called transitioning to adulthood, it's really scary.
Very scary.
I consider myself still in the transition, which isn't a bad thing. You know, I mean, we have to look at that.
But parents and the child are scared of it because you hear so many, no offense, but horror stories.
Absolutely.
About, you know, once they turn 22, they kind of drop off the
cliff,
the edge.
Abuse of persons with disabilities.
Right.
So many, you know, people being taken advantage of. One of the things that I've recommended for years always is, you know, get involved with the local independent living center. You know, the 11 that are around the state. Now, you may be a young person that lives in Woburn, but you're going to go to school down at Bridgewater State University. So maybe you want to call us because we're down, you know, right around the corner from Bridgewater State University.
Right.
And, you know, the center is one of the places that what's really made the center set apart from other folks is we've worked with folks for over 35 years, 40 years with BCIL that fall through that gap, that 18 to 60 gap.
Yep.
You know, the 22 to 60 gap. All of a sudden, you turn 22 years old, you fall off a cliff. And you look and there's this big mess of there's no services there until you turn 60 years old. Well, that's a long time.
Very long time.
You know, and so what the centers do, each of us work with folks regardless of age. To understand how a center provides services is they're a cross-disability organization. So they work with a person with any disability. They're a cross-age organization. They work with a person, we say at our center, from 2 minutes to 200 years old, although we've never had a 200-year-old that we work with. So we work with folks of any age. We work with folks of any culture. Now, does that mean the Independent Living Center is going to be the place that you're going to get all of your services? No. Absolutely not. But what an Independent Living Center does is more than anything, it empowers you, but it also points you towards the resources.
I see.
And the other thing that an independent living center does that's different than all of those other organizations that are out there is they support your right as a person with a disability to take a risk.
Oh, okay.
And so when you look at the right to fail is part of the independent living philosophy. And we have to look at the fact that even as young people, regardless of whether you have a disability or not, your mom looked at you at one point in life and told you not to touch the stove, right?
Right.
So what did you do?
Touch the stove. Yeah.
You know, and what did we learn by that?
That it's hot.
and you know what? That's the right to fail. That's the right to take a risk, the understanding. And you know, so many other organizations only provide what's called safety net services.
Right.
And unfortunately, sometimes those safety net services are good intended and provided with good intention, but they're not giving you as the person with a disability the opportunity to experience them for yourself and the opportunity to make the choices for yourself. So an independent living center will help guide somebody to what the choice is for them, not what the choice is for the center.
Okay. Now, what does quality of life mean to a person who has a disability?
You know, you could ask any person that question and it's going to be different, regardless of whether or not we have a disability. You know, there's a lot of people that have this fear of disability as a whole. And you hear statements like, oh my God, if I ever got in a car accident and had to use a wheelchair, that would be it. And that's the kindest way I can say it.
Right.
Unfortunately, it's because of fear.
Mm-hmm.
It's because of the fear that, well, am I going to be able to have a life if I use a wheelchair?
Right.
Well, the reality of it is this fear of disability is because it's the fear of the unknown.
Right.
It's the fear of what's not normal. I have friends that have disabilities that are nonverbal,
Mm-hmm.
that have incredible lives.
I think that's great.
And
I have a nonverbal child.
And you can have an incredible life.
Mm-hmm.
And quality of life is how you as an individual define quality of life.
Okay, well, thank you.
I can't define your quality of life.
Yeah.
But it's how each of us as a person defines that internally.
Well, I thank you very much for coming today. I learned a lot.
Nice.
Making yourself heard through self-advocacy empowers you and gives you a sense of control over your life. When individuals with disabilities represent themselves by knowing who they are and what they want, strengthens their desire to participate in the world. Thank you, and till next time on You're Not Alone, Surviving Your Child's Disability.